air, land, and water. That's where wars have traditionally been fought. Yet cyberspace has increasingly become the new frontier. It's a shifting paradigm, and it is transforming the battlefield of 21st century in the foreseeable future. The costs of cyber hacking are prohibitive. It disrupts commerce, compromises the supply chain, and adds cost to doing business. Cybersecurity has become a national security issue and a top priority for the Department of Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Deepak Behel. I am the Program Director of the USC Center for Economic Development. It is a sheer pleasure, a great pleasure to see you all here. This event is part of the Center's Innovation Forum series, sponsored by the Office of Economic Adjustment, Department of Defense. On behalf of the Center, we welcome our guests, Honorable Dean, respected faculty, they're probably online, industry partners, students, and friends for joining us in person and online. I would also like to extend a warm welcome and sincere gratitude to General Petraeus and Dr. Neuman for engaging in this very important discussion. Now, I would like to request our Dean of the Price School, Jack Knott, who has graced this occasion with his presence, to give introductory remarks. Would you please give a warm welcome to Dean Jack Knott?
Thank you very much, Deepak. And on behalf of the USC Saul Price School of Public Policy, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this fireside chat. We don't have a fireside, but we're going to call it a fireside chat on cybersecurity with General Petraeus and with Dr. Neuman. You know, as Deepak said, cybersecurity is one of the most significant and pressing challenges of our time, and the Price School has been very proud to collaborate with partners at USC as well as beyond to address this hugely vital issue. For example, in 1927, the Price School partnered with Northrop Grumman, a leading global security company, and the Viterbi School of Engineering to provide workshops to aerospace and defense suppliers, and as of July 2018, 34 firms have participated in this workshop, which is very impressive. And in 2018, the Department of Defense and the U.S. Air Force awarded $1 million contract to USC and Northrop Grumman to team together to conduct 40 cybersecurity workshops for DoD and non-DoD contractors across the nation. And more than 200 businesses have participated in this first day-long workshop. In addition, the Price School's USC Center for Economic Development, of which I'm very proud, continues to work closely with the U.S. Office of Economic Adjustment, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the U.S. Economic Development Administration, and the U.S. Department of Commerce on multiple projects, really, to strengthen the aerospace and defense industries and to create economic opportunities here, especially in Southern California. And I've participated in some of these events. They've had up to 140, 150 firms here at USC from primarily aerospace, working together to try to add to the economic development of this region. What many of you may know is that USC also this year is celebrating its 90th anniversary as a school. And since our founding in 1929, our school has really met every generation of challenges, like this cybersecurity challenge, with principle and with purpose and with a pioneering spirit. And our goal has been to help create a more vibrant, a more resilient and just world. So we're not only interested in the resilience of our response to this, but also justice issues regarding how it affects people at different walks of life. And General David H. Petraeus, General our esteemed guest, I know, has attacked his various challenges through his life also with purpose and principle. And I want to just give you a little bit of his background. In some ways, you probably already know this, but it's very important to identify the incredible service that he's done to our country and the world. He's been serving for over 37 years in the U.S. military, including commander of coalition forces in Iraq, commander of the U.S. Central Command, and commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following his service in the military, General Petraeus served as the director of Central Intelligence Agency, and in 2013, he took on two new roles. One is with Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts, KKR, which is an investment firm in which he came to head the Global Institute at KKR. And more recently, he's also become a partner with KKR. But from our point of view, the most important thing is he's become a Judge Whitney Professor here at USC, which is reserved for very prominent people of practice who are engaged with us at the university. And I'm also very pleased to introduce Dr. Clifford Neuman, Associate Professor of Computer Science Practice in the U.S. Viterbi School of Engineering. He's the director of the USC Center for Computer Systems Security and Associate Director of the USC Informatics Program, where he oversees the computer security curriculum. So he's right front and center involved in these issues. And as we were talking before, he's been involved in this for over 35 years. So he's really seen the evolution of the importance of cybersecurity. So will you please join me in welcoming General Petraeus and Dr. Neuman.
Okay, thank you, General Petraeus. I think we'll try to get started with an understanding of maybe what the extent of some of the problem is. So I understand that through KKR and your role on the board of directors of Optiv, perhaps several other cybersecurity interests that you have, that you've been advising clients and providing solutions for clients in the area of cybersecurity. Really, what are the kinds of cyber attacks that you've been seeing applied against your clients?
Look, first of all, it's a privilege to be here. Thanks, Professor Cliff. Thanks, Dean. Thanks, Deepak, for bringing this all together. This Center for Economic Development, I think, is a very important initiative by USC. It's all intended to keep LA great, and it has done a great job in bringing together a variety of different industries here that otherwise might be crowded out by various other economic activities in the greater LA area. And so it's a privilege to be part of that. As you note, I am on the board of the world's largest pure-play cybersecurity services firm. That's Optiv. KKR owns Optiv. There's a couple of other cybersecurity firms in which we have investments. I'm on the board of another one, and then have individual investments as a private investor in several other cybersecurity startups. I would also note that, of course, I was part of the breaking and entering crowd back in the day as a member of the armed forces and then director of the CIA. So I guess I've been on both sides of this, from the security side and then also, frankly, from the side of those who are trying to exploit opportunities to give an advantage in the military or intelligence worlds. The hacking trends that are pulled together by firms, again, like the one on whose board I sit, are very interesting because in many cases, they're still the good old-fashioned phishing attack. Some 40% or so of successful hacks actually begin with a member of a workforce double-clicking on something, a link that should not be clicked on. And surprisingly, that stays at about that level of somewhere in the 40 to 50% range, give or take a bit. And it's amazing how much just basic cyber hygiene, basic training of the workforce, training of system administrators, and a few other very, very relatively simple actions could actually reduce the success of hacking efforts very significantly. I hope that I won't ask for a show of hands for anybody who does not yet have dual-factor authentication. If you do not, however, you should probably slink out of this room at the end or approach me somewhere privately, and I can explain to you how easy that is to do on your Gmail or other email account. But it's simple steps like that. Then, of course, obviously, it's much more sophisticated efforts that you have to combat when you're in the realm of protecting very important intellectual property, very important industrial secrets, obviously national security secrets, and all the rest of this. Because indeed, there are various actors out there who are trying to exploit that. There are some who are in the business of very industrial strength intellectual property theft. There are others who are using these hacks to interfere with our democratic processes, as we saw in the case of Russia during the last presidential election, and indeed in elections of other democracies, where they're also trying to inflame debates, to pour gasoline on burning embers of debates in cyberspace and on social media. Extremists have used social media very effectively and have been able to stay on the net, interestingly, despite a lot of efforts to push them off it. And it's an area where, if we get into it, social media companies and internet providers should do a better job. And then there are other actors who are just trying to carry out theft, again, literally financial theft of some type, or financial schemes of increasingly sophisticated types. And of course, it's a cat and mouse effort here. The offense is constantly evolving. It does get more sophisticated, because once you finally do actually take the basic hygiene measures, establish the kind of comprehensive integrated cybersecurity that is necessary, then they're going to have to employ much more advanced measures of, again, getting into a network and then finding and stealing what it is that they're trying to take. And so, again, this is a very, very dynamic area. As you know, it's an area that's it's advancing so rapidly that it's almost outstripping our ability to come up with the big ideas, much less to come up with the legislation, the policies, and the regulations that are needed. It's frankly been overdue to have the kind of cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency that has just recently, just last fall, been established within the Department of Homeland Security. Many would say that that is, again, very, very overdue, and I would be among those and argued publicly for such an organization. And then even the common denominator kinds of legislative initiatives, like the Rogers-Ruppersberger bill, named for the then chairman and ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, took far too long to get through Congress. So we've got to pick up our game when it comes to the national effort to ensure cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure, which now includes, of course, our election process as well. Part of it, though, is to just try to keep up with the advances in the offensive realm, and then to develop the organizational architecture, again, the regulations, the policies, and so forth that are so critically needed. And again, there have been some encouraging steps in that regard, but as you know, some of this has lagged quite a bit. In fact, let me turn the question to you. We obviously hear a lot about major breaches at big companies, at financial institutions, even, again, in critical infrastructure. Would you judge that our systems are less secure today than they were 20 years ago, or more secure?
Well, I think the answer to this is sort of at odds with itself. I think that the security technologies in the systems make them more secure, but what has changed is the environment within which these systems operate. So if you look 20 years ago, or you look 30 years ago, or even 40 years ago, you look at things like critical infrastructure, the power grid, and there was still electronic control of the systems in those days, but how is it that these were secured then? They were secured through isolation. That is, these were on separate networks. You did not have the connections necessarily between the open internet, you didn't even have the open internet in those days, and the critical infrastructure. Our banking systems were more secure because these were computers in a locked room, and if you needed the data from those, you would physically go down to the computers, you would print out your statements. The way that users would access their statements is they would be printed on paper, dropped in the mail, and sent to them. Now, what's tended to happen over the last 20 years, especially since the dot-com bubble, is we as consumers have demanded more and more instant access to all of our data from all of our systems, including from our cell phones, including from kiosks, shared systems. And this has really changed the environment within which these systems operate. So now, when you give users access from their cell phones, you are inherently weakening the boundaries. You are reducing the amount of isolation so that adversaries are now able to get into these systems as well. Maybe they get into these systems by guessing a user's password, whereas before what they would have had to do is, first they would have had to get their way through physical barriers, the guards at the door, then they need to guess an administrator's password, and that's not to say administrators don't have good passwords, many of them don't. But when you think about the passwords that you and I have, or at least most of you have, there's a lot less security in that form of access. General Petraeus talked about the need for second factor authentication. That's because if someone, even if you don't have the password 123, but you type a stronger password at your keyboard, on your wireless device, sitting in this room, well, just look around. There are probably cameras here that might pick up what you are typing. And as a result, it provides a way for the adversary to now impersonate you. So really the problem is this change in the environment of isolation. That's one of the things that has changed. Some other things that have changed is when you start to look at the motivations and the resources of the attackers. So you go back 30 years ago, and most of the breaches that we had were either insiders, someone working at a bank that wanted to change their account balance, for example, or the hackers that wanted the fame of being able to deface a website or create some kind of attack. Now we've got nation states, we've got organized crime, you've got the financial incentive. That means that these adversaries have much greater resources. They're able to go out onto the dark web and purchase new breaches, zero-day attacks as we call them, so that, you know, in the past, many of the defenses that we had were looking for known breaches. Well, our systems today are able to detect many more known breaches, but the adversaries have access to a set of unknown breaches. So there are a lot of things that are changing, having to do with the isolation that we no longer have, having to do with the resources of the adversaries, the kinds of attacks that they're mounting that really make it more difficult to secure our systems. So our systems have better defenses, our adversaries are a lot stronger, and we don't have the inherent sort of underlying defense of physical isolation that we've used in the past as sort of the backstop against which an adversary had to overcome.
Let me ask just a quick follow-up on that, if I could. Obviously, we're now seeing the introduction of the Internet of Things, which I one time referred to, it will bring on the advent of the weaponization of everything. But what does this do in this environment? I mean, the environment is now going through a change that is much more than geometric. I mean, this is a colossal change. And what will that, in fact, do when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, the Internet of Things is going to change a lot, but understand that the origin of the Internet of Things was a long time ago. We didn't call it the Internet of Things then, but you look at critical infrastructure and security within that, you had problems there to begin with. And when you started allowing greater communication from outside, that started to create problems. In the case of critical infrastructure, you moved from sort of the isolation I spoke about a moment ago to communication through gateways where there was still an ability for an adversary to overcome some of those defenses and start to impact things that are going to have physical impact on us. If we talk about process control, we talk about air traffic control, we talk about traffic lights in the city. In fact, we had some hacking with those probably a good 20 years ago. But the change to the Internet of Things is really making those kinds of process control systems much smaller. And that means you've got a lot more endpoints. The fact that you've got a lot more endpoints, especially where those endpoints are in your home and my home, means that they are not being managed as well. You get an update, and yeah, we've got problems with existing critical infrastructure in terms of delay of getting updates to us, but many of the Internet of Things devices that we think of today, there really isn't a mechanism in place to send update to some of these devices. In others of these devices, the means by which they automatically update creates a threat vector in and of itself, because we have seen instances where the attack vector utilized by adversaries has been software updates. We saw this in the attack on Port of Long Beach and Maersk, which was affected by a software update from an accounting system in the Ukraine. We've seen it in development tools, sort of CCleaner, that affected a number of other businesses. So what Internet of Things is doing is twofold. One, you've got the greater impact from affecting, let's say, an electric vehicle, where you're able to take that over, or the steering or other kinds of things in a vehicle. The ability to amplify an attack if you start affecting power consumption at a large number of endpoints, that is, the Nest thermostats, the home automation in each of our end homes, and these endpoints are not managed because most users don't know how to manage them. Whereas in the past,
in fact, as you know, most IoT devices is such a competitive landscape that they're rushed into commercial production and sale, often have a very simple code built into it, which you're supposed to change, but which many people do not, and so it's a 000 or something along those lines. And then has all of the additional vulnerabilities that you've mentioned. So, you know, from, again, the attacker's perspective, every one of these devices is a potential attack surface. And one of the keys in cybersecurity, of course, is identifying all of the devices that touch a network, then trying to figure out how to minimize the attack surfaces, often involving pushing to the cloud, and then, and only then, actually establishing that comprehensive security that includes not just a firewall and anomaly detection, but as you said, endpoint cybersecurity, as well as identity verification, all the other applications that should make up, and tools that should make up a comprehensive and integrated and managed cybersecurity solution.
And I mean, those are all very important points. And it's not just the fact that people don't change the default passwords. The simple codes that are on many of these IoT devices, because they need to get to market quickly, you have, well, a large number of them use Linux operating system, and sure, you know, that's perhaps more secure than Windows in many instances, but what ends up happening is you've got a rudimentary pared down version of this operating system that is now embedded in many of these IoT devices, and that never gets updated. So when a vulnerability is discovered in this underlying system, it is now affecting large numbers of devices, especially a lot of the home security cameras rely on this underlying operating system, and they've got web servers, which also present a very large attack surface, as you've described. And the problem with many of the IoT devices, at least things like, let's say, security cameras or your home thermostats, is not so much what is going to be done to manipulate them, but the fact that they become a jumping off point to get through your firewalls at home where you can potentially attack another system. Because there are holes that you need to place in your firewall to allow communications into and out of these devices. A vulnerability gets exploited on the device. Now the adversary has a platform where they can launch attacks from inside your home network. And in fact, many of the denial of service attacks that we've seen in recent years have been the result of hacked Internet of Things devices. In fact, you look at the Mirai botnet, for example, which took down a lot of the name resolution, which affected things like Netflix, a lot of other large sites. that was actually caused by compromised, I think, DVRs, Internet of Things devices. Someone attacked that, was not stealing the data from your DVR, but was using that to launch an attack on other systems.
It's a cruel world out there, and you're all going to rush home and unplug every single device that you ever had and never ask Alexa for another thing in your life. Your turn, Counselor.
Okay, so
we're supposed to interrogate each other
yes.
here. At least that was the idea.
Yeah, before we give you the opportunity
That's
to
right.
interrogate us. So really, you've answered some of this already, but what do you really see as sort of the motivation behind many of the attacks that you're...
Depends on the source of the attacks, obviously. As I mentioned, Russian attacks have often been to discredit democracy, to cause problems for it, to, again, inflame debates, to put a finger on the scales of elections, all of which was clearly the case in our last presidential election, and we've seen again in some Western European countries as well. Other countries are out to steal intellectual property on a very substantial scale to try to help catch up, if you will, to where the United States is in a variety of different advanced economic areas, particularly in certain technologies. Other countries have had a very substantial scale of this to just raise money or to intimidate, a Hollywood producer. The Sony hack, as you recall, was all about North Korean concern that a film that spoofed their dear leader would actually air, and in the end, of course, it probably gave it far more prominence than it would have had otherwise. And then you have countries that are out to cause deliberate damage. Iran attacking the Saudi national oil company Aramco and destroying well over 25,000, some say as high as 35,000
And the attacks on the Ukraine power grid as well.
Yes, yeah. And again, you've seen Russia do that to Ukraine. We know that it's publicly known that other countries' intelligence services have conducted cyber reconnaissance of the U.S. electrical grid. This has been announced and acknowledged. Happily, I guess, they assume, presumably, that if they can do that to us, that we presumably can do that to them. And therefore, there is a degree of rudimentary deterrence that is at work in that regard. By the way, this also, though, raises the prospect of what I think is the one aspect of cybersecurity that really can keep you awake at night, and that is the prospect of a cyber equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction. This would be an attack that takes down the electrical grid of the large part of the United States, say the eastern seaboard, and keeps it down. So you get the sort of Hurricane Katrina effect. Remember, the damage wasn't just the initial damage of the storm. It was all that transpired in the days after that when emergency systems gradually went offline, one after another. And you can imagine the effect of keeping the electrical grid off, even with all of the emergency generators and so forth that have been installed in more recent years out of concerns over this. And you might say again, well, a nation state would not do that because presumably we would be able to make an attribution and they might sustain some of that kind of attack in return. But what about an extremist? We have, of course, there are extremists in the world that are willing to blow themselves up to take us with them. I don't know how you deter someone like that. How do you keep them from hitting the send key if they were ever to develop, again, the cyber equivalent of a WMD? Not easy, by the way. And again, in some cases, this is where the distributed nature of our systems, the fact that some are federal, state, local, municipal, and so forth. Some are still analog, thank goodness, in some cases. Some are digital. The industrial control systems are of a variety of vintages. And that may actually make it much more difficult than otherwise would be the case.
Sort of cyber diversity, actually.
It actually is in some respects, almost by default. But that is a very concerning situation, I think, especially because, again, it's very, very difficult for local authorities to hire the kind of cybersecurity talent that one would love to have in every one of these different areas of critical infrastructure, whether it's the electrical grid, water system, or what have you. Whereas the financial community, which has sustained some very substantial hacks and some very substantial fines, is literally willing to pay whatever it takes to ensure that they don't sustain additional hacks of that nature. But I guess it is my turn to ask you a question, and let me refer to my notes. What do we need to do when we develop and deploy future systems to make them more secure?
Well, there are a couple of things that we need to do. We can start with going back to what I said part of the problem was, and part of the problem is that we've moved away from the environment of isolation. So in some sense, ultimately what we're going to need to do is reintroduce some of that isolation, yet that's not necessarily a practical thing to do. Because we as consumers are now used to having instant access to all our data. So perhaps what we need to do is change what we mean by this isolation. Instead of having our systems isolated in sort of a physical sense, that is, those things that are in this company's Los Angeles office can only be accessed from there, we need to change that model of isolation so it's around particular applications. So suppose there were some way that we could develop our system so that all of our financial systems, and let's be more specific, maybe all of the financial systems that I as an individual interact with, maybe all those interactions end up isolated in some way from the other kinds of things that I do when I'm surfing the web or when I'm interacting with these unsafe Internet of Things devices. So ultimately, we need to construct boundaries around the kinds of things we're doing. By the way, for Internet of Things devices, the appliances in your home, you should really have them on a separate network than the one that you have your local disk and your financial data on. That's one aspect of isolation. But we need to develop systems that allow this kind of isolation to be done in sort of an automated way around the applications that we develop. Now, this is going to require many years because we've got to change the way that we develop many of our systems. So we've got to come up with infrastructure that's going to support this. We've got to change the way that people program their systems so that really, we already tell them, first thing to keep in mind is what data does your application need? Where is that data supposed to go? Well, maybe we can codify this in a way so that the underlying infrastructure can provide that extra barrier of isolation. So that's one of the things that we're going to want to approach there. But we're also going to need to come up with approaches to securing systems that are not simply reacting to the latest round of attack. And I think isolation is one of those things that can help there, because if you have these strong isolation mechanisms in place, when you have a vulnerability in an application, and that's inevitably going to happen. In fact, you mentioned attack surface. The problem that we've got is our attack surfaces have gotten so large because we install so many apps on our cell phone, so many apps on our devices, and these apps are getting bigger and bigger. Just look at the size of Windows, for example. There's no way you're going to avoid security vulnerabilities in those systems, but we need to make sure that the underlying infrastructure, the underlying middleware, is going to provide that extra layer of isolation. So these are some of the kinds of things that we need to do. Now, we can take isolation in another perspective, and you were talking about critical infrastructure and sort of the idea of diversity. That is, we have different systems implemented in different ways in different parts of the country. Well, one basic nature of critical infrastructure, at least within the U.S., is that these systems are what I call federated. We've got LADWP concerned with part of the grid, Southern California Edison, Pacific Gas and Electric, Chesapeake Energy. You go to different parts of the country, and you've got different companies all concerned with protecting their own part of the system. Now, this provides some level of diversity. It provides some difficulty as well because it is hard to impose the absolute requirements of security on all these different endpoints. That is, the more individuals that you've got setting policy, an adversary only needs to get to one part of them. They go to the weakest link, the lowest part of the fence. And unfortunately, in something like the power grid, you affect one component, and it has a physical impact on neighboring components, and that's what causes these major blackouts, for example. Well, we might be able to re-architect some of these systems to have a greater level of autonomy. That is, so that one part of the system is not as dependent on the parts halfway across the country for its stability. And we've got some technologies like distributed generation, that's your solar, your wind power, that tends to move generation much closer to where it is actually consumed. We can start to re-architect some of those systems so that we can get islands that can form. And by the way, this has tended to be sort of a bad word in the energy systems in the past. That is, an island would be part of the grid that became disconnected from others, and if it did not have the appropriate balance of generation and load, it would not be able to operate. Because we've got distributed generation, we might have a way where you can, in a dynamic way, determine what the optimal set of these islands are so that an attack on one part of the system is not going to cascade and take out the entire grid. So we've got to take approaches like that in terms of understanding how the system of systems is going to maintain its security and stability. We need to improve the resilience of each of the endpoints. And of course, we need to provide stronger isolation.
And for what it's worth, this is one reason why a national level agency has been so important. It's why it's good that DHS actually established it last fall. But clearly there's a great deal of work that needs to be done. But these kinds of big ideas need to actually be established. They need to be policies. They need to be regulated. There have to be regulators that oversee the implementation of them and all the rest of that. But it all starts with getting the big ideas right on this. And your last answer, I think, captured a lot of those different concepts. Let me just follow up with that and just ask one last question for you before we turn to the audience, and that is, how have you seen the attackers evolve over the last 20 years? What are their capabilities during that time?
Well, you know, I think there have been a number of things that have changed there. First of all, I'm going to throw a buzzword at you, and then I'm going to break down the buzzword a little bit. One of the kinds of attacks that frightens most is what we call APT, or advanced persistent threats. And what is meant by advanced persistent? Well, we'll take two of those words, advanced. Okay, and what we see there that makes these attacks advanced is the use of zero-day attacks. That is, attacks, exploits of software that have not yet been disclosed, and the adversaries have, we look at nation-state adversaries, organized crime adversaries, they've got resources to go out and purchase these kinds of attacks or develop them on their own. The second part of that, persistent, is really that many of these attackers have quite a bit of patience. That is, we're not talking about the script kiddie, the attacker that wanted fame, where they want to go and deface a website and see the result of that right away. Well, they see the result of it right away, and what happens? The problem gets fixed. You look at nation states, what they want to do is they want to get into the system undetected. And they want to install backdoors, install other subversions into those systems so that they will remain dormant until, you know, there's a conflict that starts up and they've got the opportunity and the particular need to exploit it at that time. And that's really what frightens me the most. It's sort of believed that, well, first of all, I'd say probably a good 90-95% of our systems out there have subversions of some kind in them. As to whether they're the APT subversions or just malware that is being used to launch denial of service attacks or mine cryptocurrency, you know, is a factor for debate. But I expect a large number of our critical infrastructure systems have subversions in them waiting to be exploited, and that's really what frightens me.
And it should. And make no mistake about it, cyberspace is an entire new battlefield domain. The equal now of ground, sea, air, subsea, space, and you now have cyberspace, and thankfully we now also have a cyber command. Although its elevation to fully fledged combatant command status really took longer than it should have as well. So again, we often are shooting behind the target when it comes to cybersecurity and the various initiatives that are necessary to improve it, whether it's in a national critical infrastructure level or indeed in business firms or in individual lives.
Right, and it is important. We've got a cyber command. Actually, there's a recent confirmed case where they mounted denial of service attacks on a Russian organization that was attempting to spread discord and influence our last election. Well, not last one, the midterm. Yeah, it was our last, our midterm elections. And I think that was an interesting case in terms of one where, they were willing to have that that publicized, or it haven't gone to deny it, because actually that particular attack was probably pretty surgical in some sense, in the sense that it wasn't going to have the, civilian or collateral damage that you might otherwise expect. But when you look at some of these things, you've got to worry about collateral damage on some of these offensive operations, even when they are done to be defensive.
No, absolutely. And just as a further point on that, one of the dynamics often is that in government, the military, and it's certainly the way I felt when I was privileged to be a commander in Iraq or Afghanistan or Central Command, we want to take down the enemy's website or ability to conduct disruptive attacks or whatever it may be. And then as I learned when I joined the intelligence community, in many cases, maybe you actually just want to watch it. You don't want to disclose that you're aware of what it is that they're doing. You don't want them to understand that you have the ability, this is the so-called sources and methods, that you have a method of actually identifying what they're doing and to
making your subversion persistent.
Yes,
so that you can
indeed. And then you can use it when you really, truly need to use it. And this is a legitimate debate and one that does go on and is publicly known. By the way, on a lot of this different information, if you want to get into more details of this, read David Sanger's book, The Perfect Weapon, or his previous book, which was about Stuxnet, which I can neither confirm nor deny, obviously, given where I was at the time, unfortunately, that he wrote that book. So we turn it over to the audience for questions, please.
So I was asked to repeat the questions. So the question is, what does we as society need to do to improve security? And the particular example had to do with how do we educate our children? Well, in fact, I'm currently working on a series of lectures for third and fourth grade students. In fact, it'll be 3.5 hour long after-school lectures that is trying to...
You have to shorten that.
Yes. Well, I was told this is what it should be over a period of weeks. But what we want to do is we want to instill some of the some of the intuition about security. That is, the more you install, the more things something does, the more friends you have on Facebook, the less secure you are. So trying to develop some of those intuitions, at least in sort of the early education stages. We also, of course, have various programs here at USC, both at the undergraduate level, master's level, where we're training students in cybersecurity. Broader than that, not just the educational aspects. What do we need to do as society to ensure that we're going to have adequate security? And I think what we need to do is provide both the appropriate incentives and disincentives. A lot of this can come up in the way of sort of liability, and in fact, that's probably a reason that a lot of the companies have become much more interested in cybersecurity. You can look at what's some of the rules that are being imposed on government contractors. And you can also look at certainly the financial sector and other sectors as well, and privacy legislation as well. Data breach disclosure laws, all of these things are creating potential liability for companies that is giving them a value to deploying cybersecurity techniques.
This is really, again, another example where the developments in this realm are just outstripping our thinking, our concepts, the big ideas. I mean, this is about ensuring an awareness of what happens when you do plug in an additional device in your home. I mean, whether it's a baby monitor or a variety of other, a security device, a camera in your doorbell, all of these, you have to be aware of what can happen if this is hacked, if it is a way into a system where you do have your data, where you have, by the way, I forget the sheer number of senior military officers who have been hacked and have had their data. And not the least then, of course, is the hacking of the Office of Personnel Management, which had all of our security clearance forms, I think 25 or 35 million. So, many, many people have been the targets of actually very significant hacking over the years, and have had to learn again about the importance of very simple cyber hygiene and very simple concepts of awareness that you're really getting at. And I think this is very, very important.
Right, and social media everyone sort of got the concept of the more friends I've got, the better. Well, how many friends can you really have? Those people that have 1,000 friends, how many of them do they really know? Okay, and you just need to rethink how it is that you think about these things.
By the way, just as an aside, I actually pay a firm, as do many people, I think, actually, that to actually scrub the internet and social media and to identify false Petraeus sites. And it's amazing how gullible some people can be. There are people who have actually sent money to impersonators before I realized that this was going on. And again, can persuade people of the most unbelievable and far-fetched schemes, but actually people are susceptible to that. And again, another area in which people need to generate a degree of an awareness and an ability to distinguish between real and again, fake. But I think the next question's up there.
Yeah, we have a question from one of our online viewers. They're asking, how effective do you feel are edge-based encryption methods, tokenization methods, blockchain-based methods, and why?
Okay. So that one sounds a little more technical. You read it into a microphone, so I probably don't need to repeat the question. But how effective are sort of edge-based methods, tokenization methods? Well, let's first break that down into a number of different things. If we're talking about encryption, if we're talking about protecting communication from one endpoint to another, the end-to-end methods are really the approaches that you're going to need. And the reason is that many of the other techniques, you've got components in the middle where the data is unprotected. So end-to-end is what we are going to want to use. The downside is the key management, and that's sort of a technical term here, but it complicates the mechanism of necessarily knowing who you are communicating with. So you may have a perfectly secure connection to someone that is impersonating someone else, the other Petraeus site, for example. So they can be effective in the sense of protecting the information, but you need to deal with other components to make sure that you are providing things to the endpoints. Tokenization actually has to do with credit card payments, and the tokenization techniques that have been applied are actually quite effective at getting sensitive information, that is the information needed to impersonate you, off of the intermediate site. So, all the major credit cards require that their merchants use tokenization methods in order to be certified as PCI compliant, for example. So that's also something that's effective. But you need to put this in place of understanding what precisely is provided. The third thing you mentioned was blockchain. Okay, and I've got a mixed view of blockchain. A mixed view because a lot of people try to misapply it. So blockchain is an ideal technology for providing integrity, making sure that data hasn't been changed, actually making sure that it hasn't been changed even by the participants that generated the data at one point, changing it after the fact. And that's because it is dependent upon a distributed, a large set of nodes that are contributing their certification to this is the data that existed at a particular point in time. And in order to change the data, it's necessary to compromise multiple endpoints, taking significant computation at each time that you're doing that. Now, there are a lot of companies now that see blockchain as the new buzzword. Combine blockchain with AI, and now you've got the perfect solution to everything. I say that sarcastically. The problem with a lot of the applications of blockchain to security is that a lot of individuals see that as protecting the privacy and confidentiality of data, which it does not. You look at most blockchains, not all of them, but most of them, the entire ledger is public. So you look at something like Bitcoin, and I can, from the public blockchain, see every movement of funds that has occurred since the start of Bitcoin. So it's not providing confidentiality. If you want to combine this with other technologies that provide confidentiality, you should be analyzing those other technologies. It's not blockchain that provided that. So it's important to understand blockchain provides some benefits, but not everything that is claimed.
Still very early stages.
Yes.
Again, just think of it as a distributed ledger that's open to all, open books.
Yes.
It does have enormous potential for supply chain integrity, as you note.
Yes.
But again, it does not come with enormous ease yet, and really very, very, I think, nascent stages of the application of this. And we'll see if it delivers on the promise that many believe it holds.
I've been seeing, especially among young people, is this notion that we're more willing to give up or at least exchange some of our privacy in exchange for this immediate access to data that you guys were talking about. So I was wondering if you could both speak to how this evolving conception of privacy has affected the cyberspace and whether we need to rethink our conception of what privacy should be.
Yeah, this is a wonderful question because it's an ongoing debate. And you see in a case that Europe, with its privacy regulations, essentially ahead of the United States and leading and imposing on social media companies certain restrictions and responsibilities that are not yet present here. You've seen a lot of debate on Capitol Hill about privacy and, again, the responsibilities of the social media providers to ensure that we truly know what's happening with data that we are either sharing with them or that they are collecting on our activities when we are online. And in many cases, it turns out that we were not aware of them sharing this with different marketing organizations and so on. So again, I think this is a wonderful subject for social debate. It is clearly ongoing now in the United States with the European data privacy regulation already having been established, and it'll be interesting to see whether we actually evolve to something close to that or whether we stay a bit less restrictive, if you will, in terms of the responsibilities of internet service providers and social media. But I mean, there's a reason that internet service providers can provide a service to us for free, and that is that they are capturing data which they are able to monetize on a massive scale, and some of these are extraordinarily profitable as a result of that. But we don't all know or are not aware of all of the activities that they're doing with data that they're collecting on us. And I think, again, this is an area that Congress will need to legislate at some point in time. And I think, thankfully, now some of the social media companies are even acknowledging that themselves after endless series of revelations and endless apologies for what clearly were egregious violations of what one would think would be a degree of a norm when it comes to privacy. There is another issue here as well, and that is the debate between privacy and national security. And I think that's another very, very interesting topic. We saw this in high relief when the FBI tried to compel Apple, which does do end-to-end, encryption, and they wanted help cracking an iPhone that had been used by someone who had been engaged in various murders. And Apple refused to do that, and in the end was not compelled to crack that. And there was a big debate in the wake of that as to whether technology firms should have a back door, if you will, if they're going to have end-to-end, that there's a way that they can get in to help various security entities like the FBI and other law enforcement organizations, and perhaps even some intelligence agencies. And so far, that has not been required. And I generally don't think that firms should be compelled to do that for a variety of reasons. One is if you have a backdoor, the criminals will find it. It'll be on the dark web. They'll sell it to you. It'll be, again, similar to a zero-day kind of exploit. Beyond that, I think if it were to be publicly known, that particular firm, and these are among the most successful technology firms in the world, and they're US-based and headquartered, that those firms might be at a disadvantage commercially as well. Not positive of that, because certainly there are some other countries that have firms where there are actual laws that those firms have to help the country if requested, although these have not, to my knowledge, been tested so far. But that's yet another very interesting debate that is, I think, will continue. And of course, if there is a security incident, as there was, that precipitated that request to Apple, you'll see that debate out in the open again. And there's no right answer to this. It's always a question of balance between, again, security and privacy, or between the internet service providers, social media companies being able to, rightly, to make a profit from their product, given that they are providing something to us that otherwise is free.
So, I sort of agree entirely, and actually it was interesting hearing you rattle off all those points because it sounded like the syllabus almost line by line for my privacy class.
Oh, you didn't realize that I'd memorized all that? Incredible recall.
And what has happened in this privacy class year by year is there's always some event that comes up. So we had Apple versus FBI the first year, so we spent a lot of time talking about that. We had Facebook and Cambridge Analytica the following year. We had GDPR, by the way, the privacy regulations he was talking about, the General Data Protection regulations in Europe, GDPR. One thing to point out is that various states within the U.S. have started to adopt various versions. So the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, takes a lot of, not all of, and by the way, there are some aspects in GDPR, especially that right to be forgotten, that goes a little bit too far in my view because it starts to infringe on free speech rights. So it's not just privacy rights, it's got to be balanced with free speech rights. Washington State just introduced legislation somewhat similar to California's regulation. And then, of course, we've seen regulations introduced nationally. Now, the problem, my take on much of what's being introduced nationally is that it is an attempt to, in essence, preempt the rights of states to impose more forceful regulations. We've got to keep an eye on that to make sure that those regulations come down on the right side as opposed to being watered down and then preempting state regulations. So I think that that's one of the things we need to be concerned about. We also have the topic of national security versus privacy that came up in the topic. And there's actually a version of this class that I'm looking to offer in the fall, which is going to be jointly with other universities, including 2 universities in China. And it's going to be a shared classroom. And that's going to be interesting to see sort of the balance and how we're going to balance some of the perspectives on this.
Well, I'd be interested in seeing if there is any kind of disruption of messages that might run afoul of the situation there.
Oh, I expect
That'll be
that. I expect that there are, and it's,
Yeah.
it's going to be jointly taught. So we're going to have to sort of thread the needle carefully. But by the way, in this class, on all my assignments, I tell students to argue both sides of each issue. So,
Well, you should make them argue both sides of each issue. I want to add two additional points here. First is, let me just also be on the record in saying that I don't believe the government should be able to compel a tech firm like Apple to create a backdoor. I also do frankly believe that the intelligence community ought to be able to crack any device out there. They just shouldn't talk about it. And it should obviously have a very, very solid legal foundation for its exploitation.
and that is what happened with Apple versus FBI. The FBI cracked, well, excuse me, at least as reported, they cracked it without Apple's assistance.
Confirm nor deny. And then let me actually talk about another debate that I think is hugely important, and this is the issue of free speech. How far should that go when it starts to become what essentially is incitement to violence, which is what you find with extremism of various types, but certainly that which was propagated by ISIS. I thought it was absolutely egregious that sermons of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the most dangerous man in the world until late 2011, I guess it was, when he was killed in Yemen. But he was a very charismatic, colloquial American English-speaking with religious knowledge and so forth, and tall and, again, good looking, if you will, and actually turned out to be extraordinarily effective in radicalizing individuals just watching his sermons. And at one point in time, they were still more easily they were actually more easily available, I think it was in 2017 than they were in 2016. Now, this is, again, that is absolutely egregious, and I think it's long overdue that social media platforms, internet service providers, and so forth take the steps to remove that. Now, they have been under much greater pressure to do that. Again, various governments have been pursuing this, and various nonprofits as well. And again, I think this is something that there has to be a national debate, and ultimately, I think there should be some legal restrictions on what is free speech and what is, again, incitement to violence, incitement to extremism.
I agree. And by the way, we had the case with the New Zealand mosque shooting live streamed on Facebook, and the difficulty of them getting that down.
Yes.
And that was just last week.
Yep.
I'm from Palm Beach County. I recently read the Mueller indictment of the 13 Russian nationals. They talked about how Palm Beach County was targeted. They had a truck that was paid for by Russian nationals that drove the Hillary Clinton pages in the back. I've seen that truck before. I had friends who attended the rallies that they started on Facebook. What could Facebook have done to kind of prevent Russian nationals from doing that? Is there a way they could have picked up where they're from? Is there anything they could have done to try and get in the way to prevent that from happening?
Let me start this in sort of the simplistic, and then I'll hand it off to the technologist. One is actually just verifying the authenticity of actual accounts, because keep in mind that many of these accounts were bots, were generated, and so you can dramatically reduce the number of clicks, the frequency, and all the rest of this, all these different algorithmic related activities if you just actually sweep the platform of what are not true, not really people, if you will. And there are, again, techniques that can be applied to do that. And that in itself has a dramatic effect on this. Then obviously the whole issue about having to identify, I mean, if something is clearly fake, and now there are armies of individuals in various places in Europe and the United States who are adjudicating literally whether something should be allowed to continue to echo and re-echo, or it should be halted. Again, keeping in mind the algorithms that drive activities on Facebook. But
Okay, but sticking on the social aspects of this, adjudicating what's fake or not. Well, first of all, even if something is fake, one may still have free speech rights to convey that. Now, the issue of authenticating the source of the data, that is one of the things that the social media sites are trying to do. But now let's step back to sort of the first part of our discussion. You authenticate the source. Well, now all of a sudden, the data breaches from companies like LinkedIn or Yahoo can be used to steal credentials. It can be used to impersonate. Rather than create fake accounts to impersonate real users, so it is sort of an arms race in some sense. You start blocking the automated ones, and then the automated tools have to impersonate real ones. So now it comes back not attributed to some fake bot, which they can catch, but it comes back attributed to you because you had a weak password on LinkedIn. So there are some issues there, and it is an arms race.
Wait till you get to deep fakes. I'm sure you've all seen these. I mean, there was one particularly good one of President Obama, and it looked exactly as if he is actually saying what it is you're hearing, except it's complete nonsense. I mean, or at least it was completely the opposite of an issue, the policy that he would have articulated, and yet it looks very, very authentic. And this is going to get better, if you will, in other words, more authentic looking all the time as we see more advances in machine learning and ultimately artificial intelligence, which will make the challenges for the social media platforms ever more diabolically difficult.
And let's understand also what is fake versus what's not. I think we've all seen a lot of things out of the government recently that, or out of certain individuals within the government that are apparently fake. You know, how do you adjudicate that in those instances?
Professor, I think we are getting the hook from the left field over here. Again, it was a privilege to be on stage with you. I volunteered to talk to your course when you get it going. And Deepak, thanks again for being the convener-in-chief for a very stimulating event.
Thank you, General Petraeus. Thank you, Dr. Neuman, for such a lively discussion. I want to thank our dean and our guests for joining us today. This was very informative, timely, and entertaining. For a moment, I thought we had entered into the realm of gaming theory. Now, last thing, I would like to thank a few individuals who were integral in putting this event together. I'm very grateful to Associate Dean Regina Nordahl, Christine Klein, Connie Rogers, Donna Jean Ward in the Dean's Office, Julie Labish in Communication and External Affairs, Shala Fatemi with Military and Veteran Initiatives, CED crew including Dion Jackson, Emily Jaden, Libby Williams, Pedro and Thomas, and the one and only Jonathan Schwartz. Thank you so much, guys.